This episode is brought to you by my free 3-part video series, FAM 101. Discover how to chart your cycles by tracking the 3 main fertile signs: cervical mucus, basal body temperature, and cervical position, and ultimately develop body literacy by paying attention to your fertile signs. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAM101 to grab your free copy. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAM101. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 214. Welcome to the 214th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. As usual, I'm excited to share today's episode with you. I'm always excited to share the episodes. But in this episode, we're actually going to be talking about something really interesting, which is hormone testing. And actually, you'll notice that there's a theme this week. The theme is that we're actually going to be talking about hormone testing. So today is a bonus episode, so an additional episode. So you actually get 2 episodes this week, which is pretty fun. And so today's episode, we're actually talking about the Dutch test. In the interview, you'll get a lot more information about what exactly it is, but basically, the Dutch test is a urine test that measures not only your regular hormone profiles, kind of like what you would get in a blood test, but it also measures the metabolites that your body produces. So not only does it tell you your hormone profile and what's happening, but it actually gives you a lot more information about how your hormones are being processed in your body. And so in today's interview, I actually have 2 guests, which is fun, and they're going to share their information and knowledge with us about these tests and how they can be used to support everything you're doing. So in particular, when you're struggling with what looks to be hormonal issues, or if you're charting your cycles and you're noticing certain challenges with your cycles or certain things that come up cyclically, so certain things that happen at certain times in your cycle, when you're working with a skilled practitioner who can help you to interpret such a complex test like this one, it can actually give a lot of insight into what's happening hormonally. So instead of just doing 1 episode on the topic, I wanted to do 2 because I thought that would be really fun. So in today's episode, we'll get into it, some of the basics, and then on Friday, we're actually going to be doing another episode with Dr. Carrie Jones on this topic, where she delves in even deeper into the metabolites, what can be gleaned from these tests, how they can be helpful, especially with regards to menstrual cycle issues and hormonal imbalances, and also why it's really important to consider working with a practitioner, but not just any old practitioner, a practitioner who specifically specializes in this area. So I'm really excited to share this little mini series with you this week. And so as soon as you start charting your cycles, you come face to face with what's actually happening in your menstrual cycle. It could be the very first time that you're actually paying attention to what's happening in your cycle and really looking at not just what's happening in your cycle, but also looking at how you feel in relation to it, whether that's emotional shifts that happen, whether you notice actual physical changes around the time of menstruation, or whether this is kind of the first time that you're learning that, hey, it's common to have, say, headaches, for example, or in relation with your menstrual cycle, but it's actually not ideal, not optimal. And that could be an indication of something that's going on. Or if you have period pain, I know that's a topic that comes up a lot in my client work, and I often have to dig for it. So I actually have to kind of dig and ask very specific questions of my clients to find out the degree and the nature of their pain, because it's something that they've experienced in many cases for so long, for so many years, that they just assume that it's totally normal, or they assume that there's nothing that can be done about it. So one of the things that happens when you start charting your cycles is all of a sudden you're really face to face with what's happening in your cycle, and you're also just more aware, you're paying closer attention, and it can really lead to a lot more questions. And so if you're finding that you're starting to chart your cycles and you're having a bit of a hard time interpreting what's happening, or you're just feeling like you don't really know what's going on, like not really sure if you're really ovulating or when it's happening, or whether or not there's some flags that should be looked further into, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/work-with-me and take a look at the programs that I offer, just to see the different ways that we can actually work together. So again, that's fertilityfriday.com/work-with-me. Now let's jump into today's episode. And I'm very excited to welcome my guests, Diana Walley and Kristen Burkett, to the show. Both Diana and Kristen are master nutrition therapists, and they both received their certification from the Nutrition Therapy Institute in Denver, Colorado. Kristen is a board-certified holistic nutritionist, and she holds a Master of Science from Texas Women's University, as well as a Bachelor of Science and a Bachelor of Arts from the New Mexico State University. Diana is a certified GAPS practitioner and a lifestyle eating and performance therapist. Diana is also board certified in holistic nutrition, and she has a bachelor's degree from the University of New Hampshire. And Diana and Kristen have an interesting story because they joined forces based on their similar focus on female hormones. They decided to come together to create restoreforyou.com. And this is an organization designed to support women to take charge of their health, but also to support practitioners to do the same. So I'm really excited to talk to them about their mission. And also in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Dutch test and how it relates to female hormone testing. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Diana and Kristen.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. We're so glad to be here today.
Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. And of course, it's always a fun episode when I get to interview two great guests at one time. So really excited to be here with both of you. So maybe, I gave an introduction. You actually met at the nutritional school. So you have similar credentials because you actually attended the same training program. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about your backgrounds and how you met and, what prompted you to join forces.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is Diana. Kristen and I both have similar stories, but some really unique differences, which really lend themselves to talking about the Dutch test and female hormone imbalance. So I'll start, rewinding back to having children nearly 15 years ago. It was the challenge of having a sick baby that really led me to go to nutrition school in the first place and become a master nutrition therapist, and then on to doing the work I do today. So I'll spare you the details of my sick baby. My daughter is a healthy teenager today, so that's a blessing. But I can tell you that going through that was one of the most stressful periods of my life. When I was trying to deal with my daughter's illness, I was going from doctor to doctor, scouring the internet late at night to try to find answers, to figure out what was wrong with her. I was hopeless. I felt completely exhausted. So, I'm an A-type person. So of course, during this time, I decided I was going to take things into my own hands, which meant enrolling into a rigorous nutrition program, which took me 4 years to complete, and putting a tremendous amount of stress on myself at that time to earn top grades, of course. Basically, for those 4 years, I was playing mom during the day. I had another child as well, playing mom during the day, needing to be the most extraordinary volunteer at school, all the things, studying at night, and still trying to heal my younger daughter. And on top of that, transitioning into starting my nutrition business and on and on. So basically, the only thing I wasn't doing was taking care of myself. And I'm sure this sounds familiar to a lot of your listeners. I literally tanked my sex and my stress hormones. So, when I hit rock bottom and I knew I had to turn things around, I went about it all wrong at first. So I tried to supplement my way out of it, without actually fixing and addressing my stress. So I still was doing all the things, but I was just taking a boatload of supplements for my adrenals, some bioidentical hormones, getting acupuncture treatments, but not addressing my lifestyle. So finally, it was my acupuncturist after, I think it was almost a year of treatments, who said, this isn't working. You really need to address your lifestyle. And of course, I thought he was crazy because I loved my life. I loved my work. I was really passionate about doing all the things, but it was just too much. And my body was sending me a message. So, when I sat with it and I knew he was right. And so then I started making changes. It took me about 8 months of really relaxing, chilling out, cutting back on my work and my volunteering, and really reframing my stress. It was doing all of those things that really helped me to get back to balance. And I got the appropriate hormone testing, which I know, Lisa, you want to talk about today, and was able to really target my supplements. So take much fewer, really target them to my personal needs and get back to balance. So, having gone through all that, I wouldn't change a thing. I'm really grateful for the journey because it helped me to identify my true calling. I met Kristen, my partner, and really helps me to understand where women are and to really help women. And, the more women we see in our nutrition practice, the more we realize how prevalent this story is and how seemingly, quote, normal symptoms like the ones I had, and fatigue, cravings, brain fog, a stubborn belly fat, chronic fatigue, period problems, all of those things are so often brushed off by conventional medicine. In fact, I was just reading that it takes women who feel like this with these kind of symptoms an average of 5 years to get help. Most women either suffer silently because they're told their symptoms are normal, or they end up going on a lot of medications for things that really could probably be managed through diet and lifestyle. So with clients now, one of the things that we love to say is check yourself before you wreck yourself. So I'm just always reminding clients of that. And, are you ignoring the little things in your life that could snowball? Life is stressful, but you don't need to be stressed.
So what would it sounds like what you experienced was, like you were like probably a couple months short of like a breakdown, but like it sounds like what you experienced was basically like HPA axis, like your dysregulation, like your adrenals were done because you had fried them essentially. Does that sound about right? Or how would you characterize it?
100%. Nailed it.
Well, and Kristen, maybe you can share just from your perspective, what kind of drew you into this work?
Sure. So my story is similar and different at the same time to Diana's. Like Diana, my hormones brought me into the nutrition field, but I didn't recognize the stress component until later in the process. In my early 40s, I had this early breast cancer diagnosis and a lumpectomy that fortunately took care of the situation, but it sent me deep into research to try to figure out why this happens and how to prevent it so that I could keep it from coming back in the future. My kiddos were depending on me. They were 2 and 4 at the time. And I was told that I had this equal chance of it happening on either side of my breast at any time in the future. And it was related to estrogen. And I just couldn't live like that. I couldn't live not knowing what my future was going to be. Not that, I feel like we can control everything. We can't, but there's definitely multiple aspects that we can take charge of. And I needed to know what those were. So all of that research led me back to school and into this second career. Along that journey, I discovered this huge connection between the stress hormones and the reproductive hormones. And for me, not only did I have big genetic issues with how I detoxified estrogen that triggered some of those breast cancer issues, but my stress response was a big mess as well. And so these all interplayed together. So cortisol, which is made by our adrenal glands, is supposed to follow this daily rhythm where it rises in the morning to give you energy, and then it's lowest before bed so you can sleep. Well, mine was completely upside down. And so it was next to impossible to fall asleep at night, and I couldn't get up the next day. But understanding that and understanding more about these issues gave me so much power, and it gave me a path to be able to correct it. And I just love sharing the information with other women. Knowledge is power. And I feel like women are so many times bound by what diagnosis their doctor gives them or what their insurance may or may not cover. And life's too short when we have this kind of knowledge about adjunct care and how we don't have to sit on the sidelines and wait to be a victim of things if we don't have to be. So I love sharing the message. And I guess that's really what I'm passionate about, is helping women understand their hormones, understanding their bodies and the significant consequences of those imbalances so that they don't have to go through some of these things. We shouldn't be experiencing breast cancer in our 40s. There's no reason for that. But our lifestyle and this world that we live in creates an environment where it's really easy to have it happen when you're least expecting it because you don't know what pieces to be on top of. So this is one of the reasons we wanted to talk with you and your audience, is because we're finding so many women are unaware of this huge connection between the stress response and the reproductive hormones, which obviously impacts fertility. While we talk about stress a lot, most women aren't familiar with the science behind that connection and kind of tend to blow it off. And they think, well, once my kids are a little bit older, it'll get better. Once I change jobs, it'll be better. And they tend to put off making these changes in their lifestyle. But we find once they understand the relationship and a little bit about the science, they start taking that whole idea of stress, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, they start taking it more seriously, and they become willing to do something about it. And it has this huge impact on improving their health, regardless of what the issue is, short-term or long-term.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And before we get into some of the nitty-gritty, I want just to ask the two of you to kind of, because we're all women and we know what it means to have a bunch of people relying on us all the time for things. So becoming a mother is a very particular challenge in that you literally have these two tiny humans, or however many tiny humans rely on you for everything, basically. So even Diana, as you were introducing yourself and you were sharing about what your experience had been, one of the things that you said was like you had this point where you had to face that your life was going to change, and you didn't even want to do it because you said, like, my life was great. I loved my life. I loved everything I was doing. So I suppose this is more of like a kind of esoteric question, but as women, we face these very real challenges where we do have a lot of demands on our time. Most of my clients work. They have the jobs that demand of their time. Many of my clients are in relationships. They have partners. They have children, other family members, friends, sisters, brothers, all these people that rely on them. So I was thinking, Diana, like, if we could go back in time and tell you in the midst of all of this to relax, like, what would you have said? Because you probably, you had a sick child. You probably didn't have those types of options. So how can we, first of all, open that conversation and also acknowledge the very real demands that are causing all the stress?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And Kristen and I talk about this all the time, and we have clients in the same situation. And, I go back to, life is stressful and life is busy, but you don't have to be stressed. So that's something that I shared when I was sharing my story. And so a lot of what I do myself and what I work with on clients is really reframing, right? So even though life may be stressful, it's how can you look at it a little bit differently? And then can you take in small steps, right? So I don't ask somebody when I first meet them, I want you to go home. So part of your nutrition action plan, which is what I call it, is to go home and meditate for an hour. So that's not where we start, right? Do you have minutes? Can you sit in your car for a minute when you get home and do a little bit of deep breathing? Do you have 5 minutes before bed that you could do a little bit of deep breathing, a little bit of meditation? Could you use the Headspace app, if you're not good with guided meditation for 5 minutes? So it's really starting small. And one thing I love that Kristen turned me on to is, could you do something small, get an essential oil diffuser, very inexpensive, that you can plug into your car and put some really calming essential oils in your car and treat yourself that way. So it's little things throughout the day. Kristen, I don't know what you have.
Yeah. And I just to build on that, one thing, if I could go back and do it over, the one thing I didn't do, because I just felt this need to prove myself as a new mom that I could handle it all. I never asked for help, and I never accepted help when it was offered. And if I could go back and do it differently, I would so say yes to help, and I would ask for it more, because as new moms, there's so many demands. And even as your kids get older, there's so many competing demands. And I think there are so many people there. We have a community of friends. We have partners. We have family members that are really willing to help if we just allow it. And we can let go of this ego thing of needing to be everything to everyone. Maybe part of it for me was I was coming out of a prior career where I was really in charge and I had a lot of responsibility. And I wanted everybody to know that I could handle being a mom. And I thought that was not as demanding as, a big career. Well, man, did I guess that one wrong. It was totally opposite. It was much more demanding than anything I'd ever done in a work field. And I didn't want to admit that to myself or anybody else. And the other thing I never really did was schedule any time for myself. I never allowed myself a chance to rest or 5 minutes in the car or anything. I mean, I just felt like I had to be on 100% of the time. And my kids, when they were little, they never slept, even when they were at night. I mean, I probably slept in the rocking chair with my son through the night for the first 2 years because it was the only way he would sleep. I never slept. I mean, I wrecked my health so much just trying to be everything to everyone. And so like you asked, what would you do differently or what would you recommend? I'd say just back off and let yourself be human and accept that there are other people willing to help you. And you don't have to get crazy with all of the unnecessary details that we tend to get caught up in.
Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to go off that point that Kristen made, which I love, as far as making that little bit of time for pleasure. Because she's right. I was thinking about that when she was talking, that I literally cut out all pleasure. I don't deserve any pleasure. And I mean, even my favorite thing now to do, my treat is that I get into bed, 30 minutes before I shut my light out and I read. And that is and I read just for pleasure, nothing to do with work or health, just pure pleasure. And I wouldn't even allow myself that because I should be cleaning my house or studying or working, and so that can just make your day just to have that little bit of pleasure. So that's a big thing that I would change. I would go back and do over.
I love that so much. It's so funny because as you work with women, I'm sure you know, if you really get into these types of conversations about stress management, I found myself asking many times, like, what do you like to do? Even going back to when you were a little girl, what was something you enjoyed doing that made you happy? Because there's something about, becoming a grown up and getting a job and doing everything we're supposed to be doing that it seems to preclude us from doing those, like you said, reading for 30 minutes, like doing those things that you used to really love to do. So I love that so much. And I was thinking, as you were talking, Kristen, I was thinking of when you said ask for help. One of the things that I did recently that was a really big deal for me, like culturally, was to have a woman come in and clean my house, like to actually pay someone to clean my house from time to time. Just acknowledging, like, you know what, maybe I can't do every single thing. Like maybe I need to sleep sometimes. And maybe that's better for me than to try to do every single thing. So I love that so much. So let's talk a little bit about hormone testing and why it's important. So from my perspective, as both of you know, as a fertility awareness educator, so the central piece in every meeting I have with a client is the chart. So we're always looking at a woman's menstrual cycle very in depth. And I think it's harder to ignore the signs of stress when you're like looking at your chart every month, because it's very apparent how much stress impacts your cycles. So, and the other thing that I was thinking as well is it changes as you get older. So, when you're 20, it's like you can kill your body and wreck it and just stay up all the time, drink all the coffee and eat all the sugar. But then it seems like at some point as we get older, we just can't do it anymore. I would be interested to hear your perspective on just why it changes, like at what point as we grow up as women, like at what point does it change?
That's a really good question, Lisa. I don't know if we've pinpointed like if there's an age that it actually changes. I just wonder if that resiliency of being young is just trained over time and changes over time. Because really, even now, we're seeing the impact of this in children as young as middle schools and the impact of stress on middle school kids with the demands that they have, and high schoolers. So, I think we probably feel it the most as we get older because the drain has been, it's been going down a little bit longer, but it definitely begins to show early in life. And there is a hormone pool over the lifetime that, I don't think most people are aware of, that especially for women. So if we talk about women specifically here in this context, the ovaries and the adrenal glands both produce hormones over the course of our lifetime. And when we're younger, as young adults and up through that time, our ovaries are responsible for about 3/4 of the hormones that the sex hormones that we produce. But the adrenals are already producing about 25% of that. By the time we get to midlife, half of our reproductive hormones are being produced by our adrenals and only half by the ovaries. And then once we get to the menopause years, our adrenals are responsible for 90% of the sex hormones that we need to stay healthy for the rest of our life, because we still need some estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone to keep our bones healthy, our heart healthy, our minds healthy through the rest of our years. We're not meant to go through menopause and shrivel up and die. That's like, it's a whole new chapter of our life. And so what happens is we put all of this stress, we experience all this stress from the time we're young. We put this stress on our hormones and our adrenal glands specifically, and that communication with our adrenal glands. And then by the time we need those adrenals to start backing us up and balance out our cycles and help us with our cycles and take over our cycles, we don't have anything left to give because we've drained that. Diana, you want to add to that?
Well, I was just going to say, this is one of the reasons why we use the Dutch test quite a bit in our practice. And that's one of the reasons why we love this test, is because it looks at both the stress hormones and the sex hormones all together on one test. So we can really get a good idea of how a woman is doing, both looking at progesterone and estrogen, cortisol, DHEA, testosterone. So we're looking at the whole picture so that we can see what kind of reserves do we have, and how are things going? And it's really helpful to look at those together. That's what makes it very unique.
Well, let's unpack this a little bit. I'm always thinking in the mind of the listener. So for women who just tuned into this podcast, it's like the first one that she's listening to, welcome. So, the word adrenals is thrown around a lot. Maybe you could just clarify for us. So, what are the adrenals? Where are they? What are the main hormones that they produce?
Yeah, of course. Well, what might be a good place to start is talking about cortisol, because most people have heard of cortisol, and that is a hormone that's produced in the adrenal glands. And this is really important when we talk about stress. So this might be a good place to start. So cortisol, it's a powerful stress hormone. It's a potent anti-inflammatory. You've probably heard of cortisol in relation to, and I'm using air quotes, adrenal fatigue. And the reason I'm using air quotes here is because even though the symptoms of adrenal fatigue are absolutely real, it's not a real thing. So the adrenal glands don't fatigue, and they're not meant to give out. So there's no, adrenal pause. That's not a word like menopause. So that's not a thing. But people think they are. They talk like that. I have adrenal fatigue. And when the symptoms are real, that's just not actually what's happening in the body. So instead of the term adrenal fatigue, Kristen and I really like to use the term HPA axis dysfunction. And what that stands for is hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary are in the brain, and the adrenals sit on top of the kidneys. But there's an axis, there's a communication between those. So in most people, the symptoms of adrenal fatigue that they're feeling are caused by a communication problem between the brain, that's the H and the P in HPA axis, and the adrenal glands. So the adrenals are just one leg of that system. Most of the systems in the brain, upstream from the adrenals. So in other words, the brain is the boss. The brain's the boss of the adrenal glands and tells them to produce cortisol. So, what we want to look at is how is the brain communicating with the adrenals or not communicating, as it can happen in a lot of cases. And why this is important is because the HPA axis influences the function of nearly every cell in the body. So from the gut to the brain to the thyroid to the immune system, metabolism, and of course, reproductive hormones. And, persistent stress. And again, I talked about my positive stress. That's still persistent. That's still stress, and that still affects the body. So persistent chronic stress can shut down the body over time. This is really important. And really the biggest aha here that we find when we talk about this to clients is that if cortisol is off, it doesn't take long for other hormones to be thrown off as well. So similar, how we like to relate that is similar to the effect that you see when you drop a stone in water and you get, those ripples form and they become larger and larger. That's the same way when your HPA axis system is thrown off. It can affect all the other things we talked about. And so, focusing on this connection between the stress hormones and the sex hormones is very important, because without a healthy adrenal response, it's very hard for the body to keep up with calibrating healthy levels of sex hormones. So what we teach our clients, is that chronic activation of the stress response erodes overall resilience and really depletes long-term metabolic reserves.
And just to build on that, the thing is, when we talk about stress and we say chronic stress and that impact on the HPA axis, it's such a broad category. Mm-hmm. I mean, this can be anything from over-exercise to poor nutrition to blood sugar imbalances, lack of quality sleep, difficult relationships, even commuter traffic. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the most controllable things if we choose to really dig deep to understand our personal relationship with the stressors and know what they are for us. Because all of that background noise has a real effect on our physiology and this HPA axis. The nice thing is that it's something that, as women, we can take control of and really make a difference in the health of our hormones and our bodies in general. It's really empowering when you begin to unpack what it is for you that's causing this, and that's causing the changes and the issues that you're facing physically. It's something I wanted to just point out. What we really appreciated about one of your recent podcasts that you did with Amira Posner, she really went deep into how she connects with clients to identify their own stressors and how to integrate mindfulness strategies to start reining in those effects. I loved how she got to the nitty-gritty, because that's what really matters with our women clients, is finding out what it is for you and then finding really specific strategies to begin to get on top of those things and not make them such a negative impact on your body.
Well, I really appreciate that perspective, because I think one of the things that I try to do, as you've probably gathered in the podcast, is to contextualize stress in a more tangible way, because we're all told about this stress thing and it makes it seem like it's just this really broad thing, or it makes it seem like when you hear the word stress, I think of traffic and I think of a stressful job. I think of the boss yelling at you, or a deadline coming up or something. But what I see in women's charts is what you said. All of the different things, like your sister getting married is a super happy, fun time. Stress. That summer vacation that you're planning, you're going to Thailand. Stress. And we often don't think of the happy things as stress, or even that food sensitivity that you have and you're continuing to eat that food and it causes your stomach to get really upset. Stress. Because what is stress in terms of physiological response? It's the activation of that system that you were talking about.
Exactly.
So let's talk about, what is the Dutch test then? So you mentioned that you use the Dutch test. It tests for a broad range of hormones, which you mentioned is helpful in identifying these issues. So what is the Dutch test, and what makes it different to just, going to the doctor and having them test your cortisol levels?
Well, the Dutch test, so first we should probably clarify, it's not about a country or anything like that.
You don't have to go to...
Don't have to be Dutch. Yeah.
All right. Okay.
It's an acronym. It stands for the Dried Urine Test for Comprehensive Hormones. And so it's a urine test, and we love that because you get to do it in the privacy of your own home. And it's going to look at several different points during the day where you're going to collect your urine, and it's going to assess both the free cortisol, which is what we typically associate with the stress response. It's what your body is accessing at any point during the day, but it's also going to look at your total cortisol, which gives you a whole different picture. That's what your body is making in total. Most saliva tests just look at that free cortisol. They don't look at the total cortisol. And you can have a very different physiology thing going on depending on whether or not that total cortisol is high or low relative to the free cortisol. So we love that it looks at both of those pieces. It's the only test we know of that does that. And then also it's going to look at hormones. It's going to look at your estrogen, your progesterone, your testosterone, and other things. Also DHEA, which is a precursor to testosterone and some of the other hormones. It also looks at melatonin, which is a really big thing, especially because we know what an effect sleep has on our overall stress response. So it tells us if we're making melatonin or not. It also now looks at some of the neurotransmitters, which is a whole different aspect of looking at sex hormones and the health of our hormones. So it gives us that information as well.
Okay, so it's a test that you can do at home. It measures the urine, and then it basically gives us kind of full picture of your hormonal status.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So tell me, I mean, one of the questions, of course, as a fertility awareness educator, I have to ask, because a lot of my clients that I've worked with, they're sent for blood testing, and typically it's always done based on day this of your cycle or day that. So how do you manage that to support women to make sure because the progesterone, for example, is very different one phase of the cycle versus another, and similarly with estrogen and other hormones?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the same rule would apply. So where we would ask them to get the test on, days 19 to 21-ish. Yeah, exactly.
Which gives us a good general picture, and it allows us to assess the ratios between the different hormones in a consistent way. Now, if we have women that are actually looking to use the test more for fertility purposes, there are other options. There is a cycle mapping test. So if you need to see more detail throughout different points of the cycle, that is a different option that's available as well. We don't use that as much in our practice because we mostly focus on perimenopause, but for fertility purpose, it's definitely a great test. And if women are having problems throughout their cycle that we're having trouble pinpointing, then that's a great option as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, I only ask because, I've worked with so many women who've had these tests done on day 21. Very few women ovulate exactly on day 14. So I always wonder, I'm like, are the practitioners making decisions based on this test, assuming that it was done at the right point in their cycle? But I guess you would be able to tell whether or not ovulation occurred anyways.
Well, and a lot of times we'll have women do an ovulation test and have them use a kit during their cycle so that they know for sure if they ovulated, especially in those years, like starting in their 40s, where ovulation can be hit or miss and they're having problems with their cycles. So if we have them do that or watch their body temperature or different things like that so that we can have a better idea of whether or not they did ovulate, that can definitely help the test be more realistic.
Okay. And so in terms of the test, so who benefits from the test? Like, is there some criteria that you use to identify like when a woman should take this test or when is appropriate versus when maybe something else would suit it? Or, should everyone take who should take it?
I think every woman should take it. It's just such a great test, again, because you get the sex and the stress hormones together in one test. And go ahead.
Oh, and I was just thinking, the other part I didn't mention that we get with this test, which I think just makes it so applicable for every woman, is you get the metabolites of estrogen breakdown and testosterone breakdown. So why that's so important is, women are so estrogen dominant in their 30s and 40s. And if your body isn't detoxifying and breaking down that estrogen in a healthy way, it can cause DNA damage, and that's what triggers breast cancer for so many women. So we get to see how the body is detoxifying this estrogen out and know whether or not it's in a healthy way. And if it's not, we can do things about that to help improve that pathway so that they don't have to have those dangerous metabolites floating around their body just waiting to start triggering DNA changes in breast cancer. And then we also see how testosterone breaks down. So a lot of women that have PCOS symptoms or, male pattern baldness or just different issues that relate to that, we can see why. And then once we know that, we can work on that particular pathway as well to help push that back to a more normal, reasonable path.
Mm-hmm. And that's why, I mentioned when I took the Dutch test the first time, and I was able to understand what was happening in my body and really target the supplements that I needed, because I actually don't detoxify estrogen very well. And I can't tell you the difference that it made in my symptoms and how I felt being able to really target what was going on in my body.
Yeah, because, even if your body is not making a lot of estrogen for some reason, if you're not detoxifying what you do make down a healthy pathway, you can still feel estrogen dominant and still have those symptoms. But a blood test that just showed your relative level of estrogen wouldn't tell you that. So it gives you just so much more information to work with.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is that what's interesting about, because of course I'm thinking about charting, what's interesting about charting is that you can, and it's not the same thing, obviously, because it's not a blood test. But for instance, it's so common for women to be metabolizing estrogen in a problematic way, right? Because there's one of two pathways. One is problematic and one is not. And it's so common. But when you're charting, because you end up having all this estrogen kind of floating around your body when it's not supposed to be, doing all kinds of harmful things like stimulating the development of breast cancer cells. And so sometimes that can show up on a chart in terms of mucus when you're not supposed to have it or something like that. What strikes me as useful with the Dutch test, of course, is getting all this information kind of in one fell swoop. But I feel like what strikes me is that women are just not being properly evaluated, period. And so having a test like this where everything's just there, it would force the clinician to look at all of those things. Whereas your typical woman going to the doctor draws blood and she might even have to kind of convince the doctor to draw blood and test for one or two of the things that are on this test.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think about it. If I had this test back in my 20s, when my doctor put me on a birth control pill, and I was on that for a good 15 years, if I had known that I couldn't detoxify estrogen, I might have made very different choices or approached it very differently. And I probably wouldn't have ended up in the situation I ended up in my early 40s. So it's just powerful to see this. And it's very sad and frustrating that conventional medicine doesn't look at this and doesn't offer this to their patients. So we just love that it's available to women and that we can help them get it, interpret it, use it, and improve their life with it. It's a fabulous test.
And so one thing I just I'm sorry to cut you off.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, can you go to the doctor to get it? Or how do you get it? So someone listening is like, well, I want to do a Dutch test. So how do they do it?
Well, they can. So Dutch, I think it's just Dutch.com.
Yeah, DutchTest.com.
DutchTest.com. You can go as an individual and order the test by yourself and just pay for it yourself. So anybody can order the test. If you go through a practitioner like Diana or myself, we can give discount codes from our professional price to help offset the cost of the test. But then also you get some help with interpreting it. Because while they try to make it pretty simple with a lot of good graphics to show you the results, it's a pretty complicated test in terms of how everything interacts together. So we always recommend that you try to work with somebody that's familiar with the test for the interpretation so that you really know what to do with the results once you've done them.
And how much is the test?
For specific protocols as well.
Well, yeah, because having information like, okay, your estrogen metabolism is totally messed up. Have a nice day. You need to know.
What do I do?
Now I'm just scared.
Yeah.
One thing I just wanted to say real quick is from cortisol perspective. So the Dutch also, as Kristen was mentioning, will give us free and metabolized cortisol. But we've talked about this quite a bit, that we find that often women need to see it on paper, because we can talk to them about their lifestyle and their stress, but to really see it on paper will make a big impact. And
Absolutely.
Once they see it, they're like, okay, I understand how this is affecting me now, and I'm willing to make a change. So,
I couldn't agree more. I was literally saying that to a colleague of mine this morning, because on the chart, like I mentioned, you can see a lot of, basically it tells you should test this or you should test that. And in many ways, you can see what happens on a woman's chart, for instance, like indicators of stress, and suggest like lifestyle factors, like the common sense things I'm sure we're going to talk about a little bit later, like getting enough sleep and managing stress, right? And you can see a shift in the chart, so you're on the right track. But what you said is exactly right, because I find that with my clients, it's not really tangible until you have a piece of paper that shows you that your level is totally off. So even though you had all the signs, And like, you know what I mean? Like all of the signs are there, like pointing to this problem. Like once you get that piece of paper that confirms what are, you know, the suspicions that you had, all of a sudden it like pushes her into action.
Yeah. You know, one other key difference that I just want to point out, because there are a lot of people out there who may be familiar with salivary testing for their adrenal hormones and for their cortisol. One thing that really stands out that's different with Dutch is the ability to see this total versus free cortisol. Because when you just test that free cortisol with saliva, you might see that you got too much or too little free cortisol and try to treat it with some type of a protocol just based on that one indicator. But when you put that next to the total cortisol, it may be a completely different protocol that's appropriate for you. So it provides that additional piece of information that I think has misled women for a long time by just having the salivary hormone result.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's it. Having that additional information sounds like it helps just to really kind of put everything into a better context. And so how much does the test cost, just so that the listeners have a sense of that?
With our we you know, with our discount code $250, and on their, you know, I have to say I'm not really sure on their website. We can check real quick. It's a little over $300 on their website. I
think it's $299.
$290. Okay, so $299 on their website is I believe for the Dutch Plus. And again, Kristen said they offer a couple of different tests, but we are right now really loving the Dutch Complete. And that's the one that we use most often. And again, that's going to give you the sex and stress hormones, and it's going to give you some of those neurotransmitter markers that Kristen mentioned, melatonin, and the oxidative stress marker.
All right, so let me clarify. So I'm on their website right now, and the pricing at this time, the Dutch Complete that Diana's referring to is $399. And then our practitioner code allows for $100 off of that.
Oh, okay. Well, and so for a woman who's listening, so we've been talking a lot about stress and HPA axis dysregulation, and kind of going back to both of your stories at the beginning of the call, which was that, you know, lives were very demanding. Your lives were very demanding, and you kind of wound up feeling really fatigued and having a lot of the symptoms that would indicate that your adrenals were working pretty hard. So for a woman who's listening and she's in the same boat, so I'm sure there's a woman listening who isn't busy, who isn't stressed, but has kind of been going at it pretty hard for a while and is starting to feel the effects of that. So for the woman who's kind of like, oh, I don't know if I have the $400 or the $300 to do the test, are there ways to test for certain things with your practitioner, like to kind of get some information, even though you wouldn't necessarily get the whole piece? Or how do you advise clients in that situation?
So, you know, to be honest, I always like to start with people's insurance. So we love the Dutch test, right? We love that test, but it's true. Not everybody has the means to do that right off the bat. So, you know, we always like to ask, what can you get through insurance? Because anything is helpful, right? Anything that they can get through their insurance lab work is really helpful and can kind of help narrow our focus. And of course, there are things that we can do off symptoms as well. So, you know, we will provide a client with a list of labs to get through their insurance and start there. Even if it's a morning cortisol blood draw, at least it's a little bit of information that they can get through insurance. So that's basically what I do.
Yeah. And if we can't get that, because there's times when we can't even get that.
Right.
As Diana said, we can work off symptom lists. Yeah. So there's good ways to assess high and low cortisol, high and low estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and get a feel for what that picture looks like for that person. And just looking at their lifestyle. I mean, just knowing what their day is like and what their responsibilities are like and what their exercise is like, what their food is like. All of those things are such big clues to what's going on with the hormones. So if we don't have that data up front, we can start there. You know, I think it's so common to see a woman that's super stressed. You can tell when she walks into your office, you know, she's almost hyper, just getting into the office. And then you start asking her, so what kind of exercise do you do? Well, I go to the gym 7 times a week and I do extreme workouts and I do X, Y, and Z. And then I go and I take care of my family after I go to my job and then I'm doing this at night. And, you can tell right there, okay, we need to slow down. We need to back up. We need to get back to some basics, and we need to make sure we're supporting your body with these different lifestyle factors rather than draining your body with everything. So I think there's a lot that can be done just with that kind of basic information about their life.
And you know what, Lisa? We can run all the fancy labs, and what it always comes back to is the basics. It always comes back to the basics.
So true. Well, let's talk a little bit about that because that's something I've seen quite a bit. And for all of the magical supplements out there and all of the expensive lab tests and just all of the crazy amounts of information that there are on the internet, it goes such a long way just really taking care of a woman, going back to those basics. Like how often I'll ask my clients, like, so how are you sleeping? What's your diet like? What's going on with you? How's work going? And just getting a sense of like some of those things. And it's incredible because of course I don't have access to those types of testing in my practice primarily. So we're looking at the cycle. So really that's how I gauge the progress. And it's incredible how simple lifestyle changes can really significantly improve how a woman feels, how her cycles kind of go about. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of those basic things. So for the woman listening, I think we've all been there, and many of us are still there doing all of the things, as you so eloquently said at the beginning, Dana. So what are some of the things we can just do as women? I loved some of your, I loved it when you mentioned just kind of taking 5 minutes in the car and just like doing some deep breaths before you go in the house at the end of the day. But what are some of the other things that you suggest and support your clients to do to see some improvement in these areas?
Well, we have an acronym that we love to use with our clients, just so it's an easy way to remember some of the lifestyle tips. So we call it SHINE, which we love because everyone should shine. And so I can just list out what that stands for, and then we can dive in a little bit deeper if you want to. So SHINE, when we're working with clients, we love to start with the detox. And that's just a real food. Kristen and I actually run online detox programs, and we have an absolute blast. So we get groups of women together a couple times a year, and it's real food, very gentle, nothing crazy, no water fasting or anything like that. So, we love for women to really take a look at their diet and do just a short 14-day reset, so to speak. So we start with a detox, and then the H would be healing diet. And then the I would be implement stress and sleep strategies, so big. The N would be to look at some targeted nutrients from foods and supplements. And then the E would be exercise. And we always like to say appropriate exercise, and we can even talk more about what we mean by that. So, too little exercise is not good, but too much exercise isn't good either. Mm-hmm. So do you want to jump in or?
No, we love using that acronym because each one of those things we can go into detail with our clients with and find what's going to work for them and what's going to resonate with them in each one of those. And as Diana said, that detox that we start with, it's really about cleaning up the diet and getting back to whole foods, real foods, back to clean eating and supportive nutrition. And that to us as nutritionists, that's one of our most important factors. The other thing is to clean up your personal care products too, and the things that we're exposed to, because there's as much toxin exposure in our personal care products and cleaning products as there are foods that we're eating if we're eating a lot of pesticides. So, it takes 8 seconds for chemicals to get into our bloodstream when we put them on our body. So we know that we're exposed to a lot of things that way too. So detoxifying in multiple ways in our life is the great place to start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, healing diet, that's really individual. For example, if there's somebody that has true HPA axis dysfunction, maybe they need to eat a little bit more frequently versus somebody has really high cortisol and is trying to lose body fat, and maybe they need to eat a little bit less. So we really, hone in on the diet. And the next one down the line is implementing stress and sleep strategies. These are really, really big. And we really like to talk to women about perceived stress. So it's really important, not just the real stress in your life, but how are you perceiving that? So, and women can look this up online if you're listening. There's a way to measure your perceived stress, which can really help you to identify if this is a problem for you. And it's called the Perceived Stress Scale, PSS. And if you just Google that, it's a questionnaire by Dr. Sheldon Cohen. And that's actually been validated in clinical research. So we really like to look at that. And that can be really predictive of HPA axis dysfunction. So how much you perceive your life to be stressful. And, sleep tips. I think we could do a whole podcast just on sleep.
It's so important because that is the one thing I think women tend to skip out on more than anything is sleep, is they will sacrifice their sleep to get everything else done. And it may be more foundational than their nutrition, is to make sure they're getting enough sleep. And I don't know, I've not worked with a client yet that was getting a minimum 7 or 8 hours of sleep. And if they weren't sleeping well. They're waking up multiple times, so they're not getting good quality sleep. So really, between diet and sleep, that's probably where I focus the most with my clients, because if you're not eating well and you're not sleeping, nothing's going to work right. Nothing's going to happen. So that's a really big one for us.
Yeah. And I just on the sleep thing, one thing that I always get a giggle out of clients, Kristen and I have shared this, is that we'll say, we've seen in the research that only about 6% of people do well on less than 7 hours of sleep. And chances are you're not one of them. Mm-hmm. So, it's people, I don't need that much sleep. So really, we need 8 hours of sleep a night. And it's just making the time for that and really valuing that. And it affects everything.
Oh, yeah. The research is really clear. As soon as you start getting less than 7 hours of sleep, the risks of all of the diseases go up, including cancer and diabetes and cardiovascular disease and all that kind of stuff. It's crazy.
Yeah. Layering the stress and how it affects that sleep. And it's just a hot.
Well, and you touched on exercise, so I'd love for you to just touch a little bit on that because, of course, exercise is a huge topic. Again, it could be a topic of an entire podcast, but there's a lot of demands. I mean, we haven't really talked about the kind of the social aspects of this problem, which is that as women, there's a lot of expectations, some real, some that we put on ourselves, but expectation to kind of have it all together, to do everything that you need to do at work, to have everything together at home, to have everything together in your relationship, to take perfect care of your kids. And then also you have to look like you just walked off of a movie set at all times, apparently. And so this exercise thing comes into play because, of course, we all know that exercise is good for us. But we don't always know how much is good for us.
That's such a great point. And, I think we've become so obsessed with exercise and feeling like we have to do these major workouts every day and get up at 4:30 in the morning to get it done, to make sure we got it in. But really what Diana and I try to do more than anything with our clients is get them to back up. And for the most part, we want women to just start moving throughout the day. We'd almost rather that they got a little bit of activity scattered throughout the day, even if it's just walking around the office every couple of hours for 10 minutes, or getting outside at lunch and getting some sunshine on their face and walking around. That's probably even more important than doing an exercise class, because it's that movement throughout the day that's more critical to health than anything else. So they say that sitting is the new smoking in terms of the impact on your health anymore. So while we love to get women to do strength training, we think the research is showing that that's really the most beneficial for us long-term is the strength exercise over intense cardio work. A little bit of strength training, maybe a couple of times a week. And that can be worked in your house with your kids or lots of different ways. It doesn't have to be in a gym. But between that and movement throughout the day, those are really the two keys. And it's almost like when you start telling women about this, at first they look at you like you're crazy. Then they look a little scared. And then all of a sudden, it's like this look of relief. It's like, oh my God, I think I can handle that. I think I can make that work for myself. And I might even feel better for doing it. So from my perspective, that's the main point we drive home,
Yeah. And it might be a result of where where we live too in Colorado. We have a lot of people that are super active. And I more often than not end up talking women into exercising less. And they're not reaching their health goals. You only have so much metabolic reserve, and they're spending it on their family and their job, and then they're trying to do CrossFit 7 days a week on top of that. And I'm not bashing CrossFit, but just as an example, and maybe trying to keep up with their husband. And something that we always say is, you're not a small man. Women are not small men, and you can't expect to keep up with your husband if he's doing CrossFit 7 days a week and feels fantastic. We have hormones that are a little bit more complex. So that's something that I find that I'm often having women incorporate more walking, like Kristen said, and then just the daily activity. So you've probably heard of the term NEAT, NEAT, which stands for non-exercise activity thermogenesis. It's a real thing. And what that stands for is, what that means is, just like Kristen was saying, that activity that you get throughout the day, that movement. So it can be walking, it can be cleaning your house, playing with your children. So all of those things really add up and really matter. In fact, as Kristen said, it's much better to be active like that during the day and moving a lot than going to the gym for 1 hour and sitting for the rest of the day. So that movement is really, really important. Lisa, do you ever heard of a study that was done with the chambermaids by Ellen Langer out of Harvard? Do you know that study?
No.
Oh, I'll just real quick. This is Kristen and I love this study. So kind of in a nutshell, they were studying chambermaids. And at the beginning of the study, the women were the chambermaids, which, that's a pretty active job. They were asked how much exercise they got. And a third of the women said, oh, we don't get any exercise at all, during the workday. And 2/3 said they didn't get much. 1/3 said not at all. And then the 2/3 said not much. So researchers they did some lab work on them and confirmed that they all had poor health, similar to the health of a sedentary person. So then half of these women were told, what you're doing is really exercise. So all of the vacuuming and the scrubbing tubs and the making beds, like that's exercise. So they told half of the women that. And then the other half, the control group, they didn't tell anything at all. Well, come to find out, at the end of the study, they did labs on these women. So they tested them again, and they had significant improvements in their health, the women that were told they were exercising. So I'm telling you that. So if we can reframe that those daily activities into thinking that we're exercising, that could really make a positive health impact. I just think that study is fascinating.
That's really neat. It's so interesting how much of a difference that whole piece of being told versus not, like, it's really fascinating in the research. Yeah. So as we are kind of drawing near to the end of our interview today, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground. I feel like we've talked quite a bit, and I really appreciate that we're delving into some of the practical ways of thinking about managing stress, because it's so apparent how significantly stress impacts our health and our menstrual cycle, our reproductive health, our overall health. So I think it's really important to keep this conversation going so that we can really start to think about it. Because one thing I love about the charting aspect and paying attention to the menstrual cycle is because it takes stress out of this kind of vague concept place and puts it into a very real, literal place. And I feel like potentially in your practice, having the use of the Dutch test to kind of quantify what's happening and to really put it on paper, perhaps it feels very much the same, because we're taking this kind of concept and making it very like it's right in front of your face. Like, we can look at it, we can touch it. This is what's happening. So with that in mind, what is something that you want to leave the listeners with today? There was kind of the most important takeaway from our conversation.
Well, I guess from my perspective, it would be that we can't ignore the effect of stress and think it's going to be okay later, and that we don't have to pay attention to it now. The health consequences will follow you, and they're going to affect you now and in the long term. We don't live in a culture that's health supportive. We live in a crazy culture. And to be healthy and to be on top of this, we have to go against the grain a little bit. And we have to be okay with that because we've got to believe in ourselves and do what's right for us and take charge for ourselves. So I would just say it's not always easy, but the short and long-term effects of avoiding it are significant, and we can't medicate our way out of it, whether it's with, supplements that you can get or medication from your doctor. It's not going to be a fix. It's 80% lifestyle. That answer isn't easy, but it's controllable and it has a huge impact. So I just encourage women to be willing to take charge and not be victims and not be a diagnosis, but to take charge and do what they can do to be on top of their health.
Love that. Yes. Those are great words to end on. Thank you so much for being here, Dan and Kristen. So for the listeners who want to learn more about what you do and want to get in touch with you to find out more about your programs, maybe you could share where they can go to find out more.
Oh, well, thanks, Lisa. So Kristen and I have a joint website that's called restoreforyou.com. And we each have individual websites as well that you can find us, and you link there from Restore For You. On restoreforyou.com, we have a free ebook with our top 7 healthy hormone hacks. So you can grab that for free. And then on restore.com, we have several courses. We have courses for practitioners and for clients. On the practitioner side, our most popular course is just basically what we talked about today, functional female hormone balancing with the Dutch test. It's a 4-hour online course. It is approved for continuing education credits. And we dive real deep into the Dutch test and then offer protocols and those sorts of things. And on the client side, our newest program, Lisa, this is right up your alley. Our newest program that we're super excited about is called Period Power. And it's actually, we really set the goal for it to be for teens and tweens to really learn about their period and take a holistic approach on solving period drama. And what we're finding with the feedback that we're getting is that moms love it too, because they're learning a lot that they didn't know about their cycle. So we're really excited about that.
Oh, that's great. I love that. I think I noticed that on your website, and then I noticed it was for teens and tweens. So I think that's really great. I was talking to my niece over the weekend, and of course I'm the auntie that's always talking about vulvas and periods. But I think it's so great. I think she's turning 14 this week. And I think it's so great to be able to grow up around this kind of conversation around how periods are totally normal, and because so many women didn't get that. So I love it. Thanks. We think, I'm sure our daughters we have 3 daughters between the 2 of us, and they're like, really, Mom? Still talking about period? More with the vaginas. Like, seriously. Yes, more with the vaginas.
Yes, more vaginas.
Yes, period, end quote. Well, thank you both so much for being here. It was my pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lisa. Keep up the great work.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/214. I hope that you enjoyed my interview with Diana and Kristen. It was a treat to have them both on the show, and really interesting topic, talking about the Dutch test and how it can be helpful for identifying issues with hormonal imbalances and really getting to the bottom of some of the challenges that you might face. So really great interview, just about going through the tools and really using this as an additional tool to support you in getting to the root of the challenges that you're facing. So if you haven't yet grabbed a copy of my free 3-part video series all about fertility awareness charting, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/fam101 to get your copy. Earlier this year, I spent some time thinking about what would be helpful, especially for the listeners of the podcast, new listeners, women who are getting into charting their cycles, or even women who are experienced charters. And what I thought would be really helpful was actually creating a 3-part video series to really take you through charting basics and also to provide a lot of helpful resources to get you started on your journey. So again, that's fertilityfriday.com/fam101. And I just want to thank you for taking the time to hang out with me today and listen to the show. As I mentioned at the top of the show, in Friday's episode, we're actually going to be delving even deeper into the Dutch test. And so this is just a topic that came to me. Actually, it was Diana and Kristen who contacted me and asked if I wanted to dig deeper into the Dutch test. And that kind of started my fascination, wanting to really learn more about it. And so instead of doing just one episode, I thought, hey, let's do 2. Let's really delve into this topic. So, and especially within my community, testing is a question that comes up a lot. What tests should I get? When should I get them? And in this day and age, it's often hard to get testing done from your primary care practitioner if they don't specialize in this area. And so it often leaves you feeling like, okay, well, what do I do? Which test do I need? And who can really help me to interpret it? And so if you have those questions, you're really going to love Friday's episode because we really delve into that more than I thought we would, actually, but really happy that we did. So you're really going to enjoy Friday's episode. So until then, thank you so much for tuning in, for hanging out with me today. And until next time, be well and happy charting.